Olá a todos e todas, estamos dando continuidade ao nosso ciclo internacional de conferências sobre a Palestina. Essa é a nossa última conferência e nela encerraremos com um convidado muito especial, pois ele relaciona, em toda a sua trajetória, o colonialismo com o caso palestino. Professor Lorenzo Veracini ensina História e Ciência Política na Universidade de Swinburne, em Melbourne, Austrália. A sua investigação centra-se na história comparada dos sistemas coloniais. É autor de inúmeras obras sobre o colonialismo de assentamento, ou também de povoamento, a depender da tradução, sendo um dos expoentes do chamado Settler Colonialism Studies. Dentre seus trabalhos, gostaria de destacar os livros Israel and Settler Society, The Settler Colonial Present, publicado em 2015, e Colonialism, A Global History, mais recente, de 2022. Professor Lorenzo Veracini também coeditou a coletânea The Routledge Handbook of History of Settler Colonialism e foi editor fundador do Settler Colonial Studies. Professor Lorenzo, it's an honor to have you with us today. Please feel free to start your speech. We are here to listen to you. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you for your kind invitation. It's good to be here. It is a winter night. It is a couple of degrees outside. I've got my fire going, and I look forward to our conversation. Hopefully, we can have a very productive session. But before I begin, I want to let everybody know that I know that my scholarship thrives in Jara country. The Jara people of this land never ceded it, and they are aware of what I'm doing. They are aware I am here, and they are aware that I am committed to pursue scholarship in a way that recognizes indigenous sovereignty and demands. Okay, so I was thinking how to best approach the topic of settler colonialism in Palestine, and so especially because I am not really sure what the status is in terms of how colonialism and settler colonialism is discussed in a Lusophone country in Brazil. I realized, thanks to Felipe just now, that even the translation of settler colonialism is it's ambivalent in Portuguese. So I will start by introducing what my methodology is in the study of colonialism. I have no ambition to explain what colonialism is, especially to an outfit called Caliban. But it would be a good introduction to my methodology, and it kind of will lead to the question of what happens in Palestine. So I'm an historian of colonial systems. I'm a global historian, and I have expertise in settler colonialism, which is a specific mode of domination that is distinct from other types of colonialism. I'll get back to the differences separating these two modes of domination. They should be seen as ideal types. And so I am approaching this topic in a quite theoretical way before moving on to an actual site of settler colonial domination. Okay, so colonialism, how do we define it? It's a relationship. It's an unequal relationship. And the finding of my my research, decades of research by now, is that it is typically made of displacement and domination. So you have a transfer, you have a dislocation, you have movement across space. It's a necessary characteristics of this relationship, and you have domination. Domination of one party over the other, of the colonizers over colonized constituencies. And we all know that there is no domination without violence. Now, it is actually more complex. The separation of metropole and colony is created by way of displacement, but displacement, and thus the separation between colonizer and colonized, which is then usually reinstated, reasserted by controlling the colonized's mobility. So this is a summarized version of my approach. I'm happy to expand more later on if you think this is going to be productive. In practice, if you could buy colonialism at supermarkets, you would go to some shelf, aisle 5, I don't know, and you would find many products. They would be packaged in many locations, mostly in the global north. And they would be presented in many national styles. You could perhaps buy preserved old-style colonialism, or you may be purchasing it fresh, like neocolonialism style. And you would turn the jar over and look at the ingredients, and first and second, there would always be violence and displacement. Let's keep this in mind, because it's going to be sort of a defining feature of my intervention when it comes to Palestine. By way of introduction, I should also add that I observe colonialism and colonial phenomena like an aeronautic engineer studies gravity. The purpose is to beat it, to fly against its effects. So it's not just about observing a phenomenon, but also maintaining an ethical stance and a critical stance in relation to it. Why would you want to buy a jar of that stuff and keep it in the house? I don't buy it, even though I am a settler. And considering what goes into its making, it is gross. Still, it can be used for many jobs: looting, monopolies, protected markets, unfree labor if you need it, diffusing internal contradiction if you have them, and many more jobs. No wonder that over the last few centuries, many have bought it. I should also add that it's incredibly toxic. Okay, that said, I want to expand on the distinction between settler colonialism as a mode of domination and colonialism as a mode of domination. They are not the same, and I want to make a case as to why they could even be considered antithetical, even though they obviously mixed in practice routinely, and no, they are nowhere in their ideal typical isolation. If I'm a colonizer, I stand by some cliff, I take a boat, I go and cross the water, I get to a new place, new to me, obviously, and not to anyone else who is there already. And if I'm interested in building colonial relationships, I would demand that the people I encountered there work for me. I would be in the business of extracting labor from them, of appropriating their labor. If I don't find people there, or if the people I find there are still retaining the ability of resisting or moving along, and they cannot provide a reliable source of labor, I would bring labor from somewhere else. But the principle is that in the end, I would build a big house, I would place it on top of a hill, and at the end of the day, I would be sipping gin, rum, and I would be looking down, and I would see people living in land that I claim is mine, living in barracks, and working for me. And that's the most important thing that goes into the colonizer's mind, is that this is an appropriate relation. They think so. And they think that this relationship should reproduce itself, in the sense that in the future, the colonizer thinks that this relationship should remain the same, should be ongoing, should not be interrupted, should not be disrupted. And so colonialism is a relationship that is unequal and violent, that reproduces itself through time. If colonialism continues, that's what colonialism wants. It's ongoing. And what happens in the periodic crises that affect this mode of domination is that there is transformation, but the fundamental distinction between colonizer and colonized is reasserted. You could have emancipation, but the system finds ways of reproducing itself beyond slavery. There may be nominal independence at the moment of decolonization, but the colonial system finds way of reproducing itself by way of neocolonial arrangements. And then I want to talk about settler colonialism and how it's different. It's a story you all know, and I can piggyback on what you know about this story. There is still this guy by a cliff in an island. He goes onto a boat, he goes across the water, he gets to a new place, and he will find people there. And he's not interested in their labor. He tells them that they must go, that they must disappear, that they must move along. He possibly even tells them, look, I was told no one was here. I was told that this land was unowned. I was told that this land was terra nullius. And if he's able to go and get his way, he doesn't go alone, obviously. It's still a violent process. It's a terrifyingly violent process. But at the end of the day, they will be living in a cottage. They'll have a bit of a front yard. They would have a white picket fence at the end of the street, at the end of the yard. They would have probably a veranda, and they'd be drinking beer at the end of the day, and they will be looking down the street. And there would be people living at the end of town by the river. They would be living in shanties, and they would be the remnants of the indigenous people, but he is not interested in them, in the sense that he's thinking about the future. He's thinking about what happens when settler colonialism happens. And he's thinking that in the future, the people that he's seeing at the end of the street won't be there. They'll have disappeared. they'll be gone. That's why in settler colonial studies as a field, as an autonomous field of studies, often the conclusion, Patrick Wolf's conclusion about settler colonialism is cited. Patrick was my teacher, and he famously said that settler colonialism operates in accordance with the logic of elimination. So you have a logic of reproduction, and you have a logic of elimination. And they're both colonialism, but they're obviously not the same, because they head towards different places. They head in different directions. We can return to this kind of framework if you think it is productive. But by way of conclusion, I want to also say that it never really works. Neither really works. Colonialism is always challenged. The colonial situation is a volcano. The colonizers have nightmares about servile insurrections, and the legitimacy of the colonial system is never acknowledged. Even though colonial systems have proven to be extremely resilient, there is a big history of anti-colonial resistance, and we should never accept the colonial logic that aims to proclaim that colonialism will reproduce itself through time. On the other hand, I also want to say that settler colonialism never really works. The indigenous proves resilient. The indigenous collective survives. The indigenous collective successfully defies the logic of elimination. And for example, in Australia, where the violence of the settler invaders and afterwards the violence of the settler society was comparatively even more unrestrained than elsewhere, we have today a situation in which indigenous demands are inescapable. So I write from Australia, and it is a settler society. I should say that indigenous Australia survived, and even though settler Australia once proclaimed to be finished, to be accomplished, to be a society where the process of colonization had run its course, this is challenged. Okay, so let's get to Palestine. I've spoken for 20 minutes. I'm really sorry, but it is important, I think, that we are clear about what we are talking about. Zionism is a settler colonial movement. There is no doubt whatsoever about it. The Zionists that went to Palestine in the early 20th century were using the language of settler colonizers. They didn't see a problem there. They were telling their partners in colonial endeavors in London and elsewhere that they were settler colonizers, and that that's what they were doing. They proceeded in their colonizing endeavors in ways that are clearly recognizably following the logic of elimination I was referring to before. And once they established the polity, Zionists were in the business of turning immigrants and refugees and survivors into settlers. And into settlers, they did turn them. Israel was a settler frontier and then became a settler society. And then a new settler frontier was attached to it, and the cycle continued. I should say that many comparative paradigms have been offered to explore the conflict in Palestine. I'm thinking off my head genocide, and I'm thinking also apartheid, and I'm thinking the war of ethno-national religion. So various paradigms have been offered, and settler colonial studies have been added to the mix in the early 2000s. And I did that. My book did it. I was the first, and it kickstarted a significant transformation in the study of the conflict. I should say that Palestinians had always spoken about settler colonialism already in the 50s and 60s. But this notion did not enter the political lexicon at the time. But it did so in concomitance with the Second Intifada. And having been the first, obviously doesn't mean that my analysis was the most appropriate. And I should say that since then, many have adopted this interpretive paradigm, and many Palestinians also have. I should also say that the settler colonial paradigm is useful, is productive for a Palestinian national movement that is facing the political fragmentation, the shattering that history and Zionism have placed on it. You have Palestinians in the diaspora, you have Palestinians in the West Bank, you have Palestinians in Gaza and in East Jerusalem, and you have Palestinians in Israel. And what's especially tempting in settler colonial studies as a paradigm in this context is that the logic of elimination applies to all these constituencies. I should also say that studying the conflict in Palestine as an instance of a settler colonial movement and a process of settler colonization is not anti-Semitic. There have been several attempts in asserting that it is an intolerably anti-Semitic proposition, but I should state outright that that's not the case. It's not anti-Semitic because it doesn't single Jewish people out. On the contrary, settler colonial studies as a comparative field observes that there are settler polities located all over the place, in every continent, that there are the white settler societies of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, but there are other polities that witness some form or other of settler colonial relations to land. And I was privileged to read lately a manuscript about Brazil being considered a settler society. So there is no singling out, there is no double standards. And also by now, there is no delegitimation, because by now there is a significant body of experience, of international experience, that coalesced in the last 3 decades when the settler societies of Australia, New Zealand, Australia is lagging behind, but New Zealand and Canada and the United States have embraced what have been called politics of recognition. They have embraced recrafting of the political arrangements and the constitutional arrangements that characterize the settler polity in the period of its expansion. So these settler societies are reforming. I should also say that sometimes native title is recognized, that there are processes and structures in place to recognize indigenous self-governance capabilities, indigenous prerogatives over land. Sometimes apologies have been offered, which is an important point. And this body of international practice that is offered by settler colonial studies would be incredibly important in considering what should happen and what could happen in Palestine, in Israel, Palestine. And also there is the dehumanization, which is one of the classic accusations of anti-Semitic statements, discourse. There is no dehumanization because the settlers do not leave as a result of these political processes. On the contrary, these political processes are future-oriented. They are about ending the logic of elimination, of discontinuing it, not about undoing history. I should also add that these processes are incredibly contested, and whether they have delivered for indigenous constituencies is debatable, and indigenous constituencies are divided when facing the politics of recognition. But the politics of recognition are important because they terminate the foreclosure that settler colonialism as a mode of domination is premised upon, and they terminate the demand that indigenous people disappear. This hasn't happened in Palestine. What we have witnessed in the last few months is terrifying, but it's not inconsistent with what settlers do in many circumstances when their rule is challenged. Settler polities have various ways in which they can enact the logic of elimination. The most powerful of them all, comparatively speaking, in the global history of settler colonialism, is assimilation. Assimilation can be thought in racial and biological terms. In Australian history, it was called absorption, or in cultural terms, but assimilation turns indigenous people into settlers. Obviously, this strategy is not available in Palestine, which also explains why Zionism, in its more than 150-year history, has had difficulties in crafting indigenous policies that that may have been conducive to the logic of elimination. What we have today, in my opinion, is a settler project that has reached its physical limits. There are now more indigenous Palestinians in the country, in the geopolitical area dominated by Israel, than Jews. It's the first time since 1948. And this trend is populating the nightmares of Zionists. I find that even though the plausibly genocidal rage has been unleashed, I find that the settler project is incapable of projecting credibly into the future. There is no plan, and as someone who has studied the history of Palestine and Israel systematically for decades, I am surprised by this failure to plan, this failure to think ahead. What will happen now is difficult to fathom, but it is obvious that the settler project is facing a crisis that it is unlikely to overcome unless it shifts its politics in ways that transform completely the current politics of the Netanyahu government, of the settler project in general. Zionists always wanted the land, but not the Palestinians. They proclaimed so at first. They consistently operated in that direction. And they're still dreaming to one day get the land, but not the people. Indigenous peoples in Palestine have endured more than a century of explicit policies enacted by the sovereign, which aimed at their disconnection from the land. They have performed their samud, which is translated in English as steadfastness. They have remained on the land. They have continued to craft stories about their belonging to the land that are defined by an ontological relationship to the land. Palestinians have emerged as a national collective in the land. And on the contrary, Zionists have always narrated stories about their belonging to the land that were crafted in an historical register. It was the story of a group of people moving to the land. And this group of people, this collective, was pre-constituted, was constituted elsewhere. So what we have is two ways of narrating belonging. One is a typical indigenous way of narrating belonging. One is a typical settler colonial way of narrating belonging. And by way of conclusion, I hope to to have prompted some questions. By way of conclusion, I want to say that Palestinians do not have to change the way they narrate their belonging to the land, but Zionists do. And what's at stake for them is the fundamental question of imagining the future of a settler society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo, for this for your speech in our seminar series. Now we have the questions from our audience, and we have a question by Juliana de Oliveira Veloso. She asks, "Thank you for the talk. I have a question. In the book Colonialism, A Global History, you wrote, the global economy shaped by neoliberalism are not that dissimilar from classic imperialism. How do you think this logic of profitable extermination in settler colonialism is related to neoliberalism and imperialism nowadays?"
First of all, anything I said in that book, I recant because it was part of my social democratic phase. And no, I'm joking. This is an important question. I've been thinking about this. This is a topic that has been the focus of many, including Yanis Varoufakis, including Nancy Fraser, including Mackenzie Wark. So many have been thinking about how whether we are facing a new dispensation, whether classic capitalism is being replaced by something else. So let me walk back. Normally, colonialism and capitalism as modes of domination, that we shouldn't be nostalgic about it, but they have to face the question of reproduction, right? They need to organize a system that reproduces itself. They must pay workers, otherwise they starve and do not come to the factory the following day. They have to ensure that they have a place to be where they can rest. The system must be sustainable, and this creates all sorts of contradictions. For example, classically, if you own the factory and you had to pay your workers just enough so that they could actually stay alive, you had a vested interest in fighting the politics of the landlords, people that own the land, because if they get a lot for food and agricultural product, then the captain of industry must pay more for their workers because they have to stay alive. And that's a contradiction typical of capitalism. And in colonialism, I'm thinking about slavery. If you own slaves, you have to gotta find balance, and you got to take a lot of things into consideration. But basically, you must have your slaves, otherwise your plantations don't run themselves, don't turn a profit. And so either you treat your slaves just well enough for them to survive, or you must have access to more from somewhere else. So traditionally these systems, they didn't like to, but they had to think about reproduction. But I think your question is incredibly productive, because it sort of nails the question of reproduction, because the current dispensation, the current sort of neoliberal, neo-capitalist dispensation, doesn't take reproduction into the picture. It's irresponsible. It's not interested in thinking the future. It's it is understood that it has so much labor that if we die on the side of the street, or if we eat rubbish, or if we live in polluted environment, or if the world falls apart because of climate change, they're not interested. Their mode of accumulation is thinking maybe today and tomorrow, but not for the future. And that's an important insight, because in this sense, it is homologous. It resembles settler colonialism as a mode of domination. Settler colonialism also didn't care if indigenous people died, because that was the main point. It actually helped the mode of accumulation rather than not. And so if I understood your question, I think that it would be really interesting for us to think collectively about the question of reproduction and how the new dispensation is being irresponsible. I'm a very old guy by now, but I grew at a time when the people that organized production, the bourgeoisie, were very responsible. They had plans. They knew who was making what and where and how, and who was going to buy it and where it was coming from, and they were really punctilious in thinking the social reproduction of the system. But I find that those in charge now have other ways of accumulation, and they're pursuing them, and that doesn't include the reproduction of the system and the people that propel it. So studying settler colonialism and the logic of elimination may be useful for the study of neoliberal economics.
Perfect. We have another question by Juliana Veloso, and she asked, it's a question about administrative detention, in which people are detained, she quotes you, not because of something they have done, but because they have been classified into a social category. Detention is applied then to erase racial minorities and groups considered dangerous or outsiders. Do you think this type of incarceration is somehow connected to the concentration camps of the past centuries? It's a regular method of the metropolis to deal with indigenous people.
Wonderful. I imagine that this question emerges in a dialogue with the article that Kim Ali and I just published in Middle East Critique. Look, first thing off, concentration camps are an invention of colonialism. It's unclear who started first, whether it was the Spaniards in Cuba or the British in South Africa. But we know for a fact that then when they were doing that, they were thinking about indigenous reservations. The cordoning off of indigenous property and access to resources, the deliberate politics of starvation that was underpinning the creation of reservations. If we were to think about a genealogy of this phenomenon, reservations were the stuff of settler colonialism since the 17th century, but they were codified as places for the detention of indigenous people and the starvation of indigenous people, the genocidal politics of controlling how much they can eat in Canada. Canada now has a good reputation as a responsible member of the international community. They even had a reputation for being peacekeepers and so on and so forth. But that genocide was experimented there, and in the transnational circulation of ideas pertaining to colonialism, that mode of detention was looked at by others, including the settlers of Australia, definitely the settlers of South Africa, but also the Zionists. The Zionists incorporated the mode of detaining indigenous people they were contending the land with. They inherited it from the British, who were the colonial authorities there for a long time, and the British developed it in Ireland. So, in this response, I already mentioned, 16 countries and 4 continents, and there is a global history of detention. And Kim and I, in this paper, were interested in teasing out the convergences between various modes of detention, and what's important for us is that the logic of elimination is applicable to particular collectives, to particular individuals, but it's a spatial logic. It's about constraining the mobility of indigenous people, and doing so not because of what they have done, but because of who they are and the relationship they entertain with the land. If you deport people from one location to another, you're taking them out of country. That's an attack on their indigeneity. They cannot socially reproduce and physically, if as indigenous, as members of a particular collective. If you take them away and you lock them up in institutions you call schools, which has been done in Canada and in Australia and in the United States, you are targeting the generational reproduction of a particular indigenous constituencies. You're killing the culture, and you're killing the child, because so many have died in that form of detention. And so we were interested in thinking laterally with this category of imprisoned indigeneity, because the settler society imprisons the indigenous collective. The settler polity is always punctiliously cordoning off the transnational and international connections of the indigenous collective. The classic expression of this cordoning off is United States Supreme Justice Marshall, who said that Indians are domestic dependent nations. Domestic dependent nations are the indigenous polities of a settler society. They have no access to an outside. They have no recall, no recourse. And I should add that one of the reasons why the settlers eventually separate from the metropole is because they are interested in maintaining the absolute monopoly of international relations over indigenous people. So indigenous people could appeal to the colonizers in the metropole, and they did, but the settlers declaring their independence make that unavailable. So that's my way of engaging with your question. Administrative detention is something we have been thinking beyond the actual paperwork.
Great. We have another question by Isabelle Fagundes. Thanks for the exposure, Lorenzo. The question is, one moment. Do you see the armed movements in Palestine as authentic colonial actions? Do you see particularities or continuities between these movements and the decolonizations of 20th century?
Okay, this is a great question, but I'm not the right person to address it. One of the rules of settler colonial studies and my engaged practice as an historian is that I take responsibility for my mob, the settlers. I am interested in observing what they do, and more importantly, in observing what they think they're doing when they do the things they're doing. So I study settlers. I have extensive knowledge of their sources, what they write, what they say to each other, the stories they craft to justify what they do. But I am incredibly uncomfortable commenting on the choices of indigenous resistors. It's not my place, and so I will not say anything about armed resistance. And that said, the second part of your question, I think I could engage with. You see, when it came to decolonizing in the decades following the end of World War II, the European empires, colonial empires, disbanding in the 50s and the 60s, the Dutch losing Indonesia, the Belgians losing the Congo, the French losing everything except a few scattered islands, and the British losing also everything except a few scattered islands. When it came to that phase, because neocolonial arrangements were already in place, because there was already a new hegemon receiving the mantle of empire in the United States, decolonization could go either way. It could be something that would benefit as a process from a nationalist demand on behalf of the colonized and a determination on behalf of the metropole that, yeah, sure, get whatever, no, doesn't matter. So often decolonization was uncontroversial. You would have a few meetings, you would chart out a schedule, a timetable, and sometimes you would need to get some nationalist leader off prison so you could become the new president. One flag would come down, one flag would come up. Some colonizer would issue a speech, pack up, and float away or fly away by that time. So that there's that time, there's that version of decolonization, and most colonies by that time weren't worth keeping. Only those who were really late in developing new modes of benefiting from the colonies were attached to their colonies, like the Portuguese. So you have that. The other option, the War of Liberation, and the colonial war of anti-insurgency, depending on where you're looking at from, depended on few variables, but the most important variable, like almost certain, if there were settlers, there would be war. It happened in Algeria, it happened in Kenya. It happened everywhere there were settlers. The struggle for decolonization was most bitter, cruel, and disastrous. So yeah.
All right, Lorenzo. Lorenzo, we have an agreement about time, but there is a question of mine, and I don't know, it's not an easy question, right? But it's the final question to our conversation. You wrote a paper with a provocative title, "Kill the Settler and Save the Man," if I am not wrong, right? And but how to do that in terms of Zionists, settlers specifically? How to kill the settler, of course, in a metaphorical way, to the man survive. And with this same question, another question is a question for to all of us of our guests. Um, what is the solution to the Palestinian question? One state or two states? Or is not a question in your research agenda? So please.
Okay, so the background to this, so that people listening in get a sense of what that quote was coming from. When the authorities in the United States were stealing indigenous children, they were taking them from their families. They were packing them off to some school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, I think, so that they would be taught in a Western style, and they would be forcibly prevented from speaking their language. It was a genocidal prospect, and the slogan that this sort of this policy of kidnapping was premised on was to kill the Indian and save the man. So using enormous inverted commas, I sort of turned that around. These inverted commas are Times New Roman 24, right? So very big. They shouldn't be misquoted. So that's the background of that expression, and Zionists are settlers, but they're settlers, but that's not the end of the story. That cannot be the end of the story. For example, Zionists themselves often think and talk as they would eventually become natives. That's something that's often been said. But Zionist modes of being are not the only available. There are other ways of being in the land. There are decolonizing options beyond packing your suitcases and leaving, even though so many have done just that in the last few months. And as I said earlier, I am a settler, for example, but my political aim is to become something else, to be part of a comprehensive repackaging of the political dispensation that I face here in Australia, so that the settler society sees to be as such. When it comes to turning yourself into natives, we have to be clear on this, because you see, settler colonialism is a relationship. You have indigenous people because you have settlers, and you have settlers because you have indigenous people, and indigenous people are defined by subjection and by not having moved, whereas the settlers are defined by conquest and movement. So as long as settler colonialism as a relationship continues, asking how long it is before the settler turns into a native is like thinking, how long does it take for a captain of industry to exploit his workers before that he turns into a proletarian? It just doesn't work like that. Or how long does husband have to be abusive to wife before he turns into a woman? Just doesn't work like that. It's a relation. So I want to tell the settlers that if they want to be something else, if they want to be contributing to the very metaphorical killing of the settler, they have to discontinue a mode of domination. They have to be something else. When it comes to how this conflict ends, the first thing I am always questioning is what we are saying when we say one-state solution or two-state solution. Because solution is a metaphor. Solution is something that you obtain by mixing a chemical compound into a liquid. It turns something in one state into something in a different state. So within the context of this metaphor, the idea is that we end up with something different and stable. And I think that that's already misleading, because relationships will be ongoing. There will be no end to relationships. Jews and Palestinians will engage with each other in the future forever. Anything else is either a fantasy or a genocidal fantasy. We don't want neither of that. And when we think about one-state solution or two-state solution, my feeling is that reality will be that we'll have a mix of solutions, a fluid mix of solutions. Fluid is also a metaphor. For some, freedom will be receiving an apology and compensation for being expelled from the land. For some, liberation will be full citizenship rights. For others, it will be a post-colonial independent state. And so, yeah, there is a possibility that what we'll be looking at is not one solution over another, but a mix of different solutions that are satisfying and for all.
Perfect. Lorenzo, we have, again, an agreement about time. Thank you for your conference. I am especially grateful because there is a huge time difference between us, not only a difference in time in terms of space, but in terms of time now. It's almost midnight in Australia now, I mean. This conversation was also a solidarity act to the struggle of Palestinian people and to the struggle of others indigenous people around the world. And I hope this is only the first conversation between us, your center, and my center, our center, the Caliban. So maybe you have a final or a last speech, feel free to do that.
It was lovely to meet you all. Hopefully next time we meet, there will be less urgency in expressing our solidarity with a brutalized people, and that the pain will not go away, but we will be in a different situation.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. Thank you so much. With that, assim nós chegamos ao fim do nosso ciclo internacional de conferências sobre a Palestina. Esse ciclo contou com especialistas de diversas áreas do mundo e diversas formações também. Gostaria de agradecer especialmente, além do nosso convidado, a todos aqueles que trabalharam para que isso acontecesse, ao apoio institucional do PPGH da UF e também aos participantes, especialmente, que organizaram o presente evento, todos aqueles que estão no backstage, trabalhando para que isso aconteça, especialmente aos alunos da pós-graduação e da graduação. Um grande abraço a todos, nos vemos em outros eventos, eu espero. Tchau, tchau.